Today we're going to take a look at mytrueancestry.com. Now, I am not being paid to advertise this website. Not at all. I wish I was, but I'm not. It is an interesting site, however. I don't know entirely how accurate it is, but the idea behind it is that they take your DNA, which you must get tested at another site, like I did mine, for instance, at Family Tree DNA, but there's many other sites that you can use. They will send you a swab kit. You will swab the inside of your mouth, and you will return the swab in a sealed package, and they will test your DNA, and they will provide you with results online. You can then take those results and submit them into this site. You can do it for free, or you can pay to get more detailed results. And they match your results to ancient samples. So when excavations are done on ancient sites, they find bodies, and they can, or bodies, usually not bodies, they find skeletons or other remains, and they can test the DNA. When I say bodies, I always think of like flesh bodies. Now, there are some bog bodies, but for the most part, you're finding skeletal remains. So when we look at my results on this website, I'm going to showcase my own results and talk a little bit about them, what I think about it, the site, and how they analyze things, is that they've compared my DNA and found it closest to a combination of Visigoth and Celt. Now, there is no known Visigothic ancestry in my family. That doesn't mean I don't have some sort of distant Visigothic ancestor. I simply don't know how I would have one, and don't think that it's likely. So what this really means is not that I am distantly related to a Visigoth. It is, in fact, that it's just the way that my DNA is sequenced is more similar to a combination that they have from an ancient Visigoth and an ancient Celt than it is to any other combination of the two. So the examples that they show you are down below. So a Visigoth plus a Celt is 3.04 genetic distance from me. Now, the lower the number, the closer that one is. So in a modern population, we're going to see later that I'm closest to someone from southwestern Britain, or England specifically, like the area of Cornwall. And so my genetics, and I think the distance there is like 2 point something. This is my closest match. Even though most of my ancestry is from Scotland and some from Ireland, I am nevertheless more similar to someone from Cornwall than I am from Ireland or from Scotland, because of the specific combination that I have, because I do have some Germanic ancestry, and because of that unique combination, I am more similar to someone from Cornwall. This is the same sort of idea. So if you take an ancient Celtic DNA sample and an ancient Frankish DNA sample, I'm 3.7 distance from that. Now, if you take Celt by itself, just an ancient Celtic sample, my distance is 6.2. But if you were just to take an ancient Saxon sample, I am actually closer to that Saxon than I am to the Celt. Does that mean I am not a Celt? I mean, I don't really want to get into this whole who is or is not a Celt thing. To me, I will tell you right now that I identify as being a Gael because of my direct ancestors, right? Who is or who is not a Celt is not something for me to determine. It is something that is culturally established by your family, by your community, by your peers. It's not something that's 100% wedded to genetics. Nevertheless, right, there is a component that is genetic to it. And we see that sort of playing out in my own genealogy here. That the reason why I always think of myself is because of my direct ancestry, and because people in my family identified as such, and taught me about elements of Gaelic culture. So that's why I identify as such. Even though perhaps I am in ways equally Celtic and equally Germanic. If you want to take this very ancient look at it. But we're going to get into that when we look at my ancient samples, and you're going to see why this becomes a little bit more interesting and a little bit more complex. And the ideas around modern identity are a little bit misguided in some ways. Now, here's my ancient sample breakdown. And what we see here is that the plurality, though not the majority, is identified as Celtic. And the rest of these groups are just various different Germanic and Nordic groups. Now, everyone in Britain has a certain amount of Germanic DNA, a certain amount of Nordic DNA because of the invasions. But I don't actually do I believe that the majority, that I actually have direct ancestors from all of these groups. I don't think that's what the results mean. The results seem to mean more that, okay, you have a 30.5% similarity with an ancient Celtic samples, but you have a 14.5% relation to these samples, and they equal it up to 100. Now, I don't think I have, a Lombard and a Frank and a Viking. Well, I probably do have Viking ancestors, in fact, but I probably don't have necessarily direct ancestors from all these different groups, but more or less we are all related in an ancient way, and through the different combinations of my DNA, this has created the result in that I am most similar in a plurality of cases to Celts, but I nonetheless share similarities with all of these different Germanic and Nordic groups. So when we look at our closest archaeogenetic matches, this doesn't necessarily mean genetic distance, but I'll show you the genetic distance here. My closest match isn't with a medieval person. It's not even with, a semi-modern person. It's with the Bronze Age Amesbury sample from 1400 BC. That's my closest archaeogenetic match with a 4.41 distance. It's relatively close. Not super close, but it's not that far either. This person's a female, and I'm 99% closer to this person than anyone else tested, which is quite high. But the other interesting thing is my next. Oops, what did I just do? Boomer tech moment. What did I do? Here we go. Okay. My next closest match is the Viking Gaelic mix Iceland. This is a person, probably a slave or someone captured from Ireland, who was then mixed with a Nordic person, and this is their genetic sample. So I am very close, in other words, to this mixture of a Celtic person and a Nordic person or a Germanic person. That's why I get these ancient results that are closer, right? Why am I closer to this Bronze Age sample, right? Because my top 3 is also another Bronze Age example. And from there, it just goes down. I start getting more and more distant. Why would I be closer to Bronze Age people than to medieval people? And the reason is because of the specific combination of DNA. So the Bronze Age people had this common shared DNA that then, after separating into different regions over time, then began to develop its own regional characteristics, right? Through interbreeding within those areas. But since I have a kind of mixture, and many other people do as well, that brings in this Germanic element later on, then you see a closer assimilation with Bronze Age samples, because it's bringing back in that mixture that used to exist within those samples that have then sort of developed into their own regions. That's my little theory on it. I'm not a genetic specialist of any sort, but that's my understanding of how I would be closer to a Bronze Age person, and then this Viking Gael, and then this Bell Beaker person, right? And from there it drops off as to my genetic similarity. I'm close to the Saxon example relatively, and again, the Saxon person might well be mixed as well with various different Celtic groups. The Saxons having come in and perhaps taken wives, or who knows what the exact situation in this person's example is, but they're from 720 AD, so they've been living after the invasion, the initial invasion. They're likely interbred with various different Celtic groups who were already in England, and so they take on these genetic qualities that more align with my own, which is still found in Britain today. And I think probably if people in various places in Britain were to take this test, they probably wouldn't get radically different results than my own. Although this site seems to suggest that they would, because then again it says I am the top 99% match for all users. Or versus all users. In other words, that 99% of other people get a lower match for this person than I do. So who knows? I'm interested to hear if anyone else does this test. Please put a message in the video below and tell me the results, and see, and we can see if there's any sort of similarities here. So we can keep going down this list. I think there's 100 ancient examples that they use, and many of the examples, it's really a mix between different Celtic groups, different Germanic groups. It'll take forever to go through them all. They have different gladiators and so on. Now, why is this person a 37 even though I'm 94% match versus all users? This number means that versus other users on this website, I am 94% closer to this Celtic British gladiator. But my genetic distance to this person is 8.2, right? So that's not that distant, but it's not that close either. And so again, it's about genetic distance, and that's if you were to map it out. This is when you see these maps and they have the little dots on them, and they show the country or the cultural group or the region, and then it will show a dot. There is a map like that on here. I'll show you it in a minute. No, actually I'll show you it right now. It's more interesting than going through all these examples here. Oh yeah, this is just a sort of more detailed one. This is talking about based on matching DNA segments, they determine that your direct genetic ancestors. And so I actually have a match in this category, a gold match, which is that this ancient sample here, this Proto-Celtic Bronze Age person, because they share certain S&P strands with me, seems to be a direct ancestor. And again, this is why I guess why I'm a Visigoth. I guess I do have a Visigothic ancestor somehow, based on this method of matching S&P strands, right? So somehow I am related to this ancient Visigoth. I again, I have no idea how, but I am, supposedly. And then perhaps more distantly, to the Gaelic settler in Viking Iceland, based on this genetic S&P match. But since it doesn't give me a gold seal for this, I'm assuming that they're sort of less certain about that. But anyways, my closest match apparently is this Celtic Bronze Age person. Chromosomal analysis. No, we're not going to get into that. Let's go to maps. Everyone likes maps. I could stare at maps all day. So here's my timeline. Here's what we look at in the Bronze Age of samples that are close to mine. The Iron Age, it's the closest samples that we have are all British. Later Iron Age, sort of late Iron, more like what people call the Roman period, is again British samples, but we get one Vandal over here. This is actually a sample from the Lugi tribe, which I actually dealt with a little while ago. That not because of this video. I actually think that maybe this distant ancestor was calling to me. And the early medieval. The early medieval is interesting because it shows this I think what this result shows is the influx of these different Germanic tribes and their influence on my own genetic sample. So that's why when we get the Visigoth and the Merovingians and so on, the Franks and the Saxons. And up here you'll see that a lot of samples are actually grouping around in this Iceland, meaning that because of this specific mixture of Germanic and Celtic, it produced a genetic strand that's similar to my own. Later medieval, again Iceland here, strangely a grouping around Denmark. And this is just from all time periods, so it's showing your overall sort of result cluster. And again, strongly in the British Isles, with just this sort of later medieval samples from the migration era. Now there is a good map that shows what I was talking about with those genetic distance. I think it's this one. Ooh, what did I just ruined it. No, what did I do? You done messed it up. Okay, here, I think it's this. Oh no, it's not even this. This is just giving the dates and the locations of each of these spots that we were looking at briefly. We're not going to do an in-depth look on all of those. No, that's not really what I want. But now, unfortunately, it's the site could be better laid out. Let's put it that way. Haplogroup analytics. Let's take a look at this. Now, my haplogroup is not R1b. My haplogroup is a sub-branch of EV13. It's like EZ something something. I don't remember the exact strand of it. It's EZ something. And it's very unique. I have barely any matches in the whole world. And so it's something very particular, but it seems to have developed from EV13, which itself came to Britain during the Roman occupation. And it seems to have come with the cavalry from the Dacians. And because in that region today, we still see a prevalence of EV13 in that general area. So it seems to have come in from Dacian cavalry that were stationed largely somewhat in Wales and also along the borders of Scotland. And so it seems that, whether through intermarriage or rape or something like that, that my paternal ancestor at some point is or was a Dacian of some kind, or at least someone associated with the Roman military, probably from somewhere in southeastern Europe. But if we look at the prevalence, right, E is only 1% of my overall haplogroup breakdown. So you have a paternal E or a paternal Y haplogroup that follows your direct male line. But then you also have, right, tons of other male ancestors as well that are not your direct male paternal line, but are nonetheless contributing to your overall genetics. And so overall, I am majority R1b. These would be representing my other male ancestors that are not my direct paternal line, but are nonetheless male ancestors of mine. 71% of those were R1b carriers, 11% were R1a, 1% were J, 10% was I2, 5% was I1, and 1% was G. So, it's fairly in keeping with the region. I have no idea what that is, but apparently they're the closest match related to my direct paternal haplogroup, which, because I did an in-depth haplogroup analysis on family tree DNA, this site doesn't appear to be able to even know what that is. Like, they can't interpret it because perhaps their haplogroup analysis isn't specific enough. So that could be an issue for you if you're really interested in tracing that down. This site isn't big on doing specific Y DNA analysis. It's more concerned about a broad overview and your broad similarities to different cultural groups. So this it's called DNA Spotlight, and it matches your sample to particular examples within particular time periods. And so, Viking Age England. Let's see what I have as a good match here. I don't have too many good matches. You can see genetic distance 13. Yeah, not really anything too close. Minoans. Let's see if I'm related to any Minoans. No. No Minoans. I'm brokenhearted about that. I love those Minoans. Let's see. Genetic distance 12. Yeah, this is that Amesbury Golden Boy. Now, it's strange here because if we look to this ancient Britain example, it matches me somewhat to in the other examples, it matches me close to Bronze Age examples, but only some Bronze Age examples, because the ones that they use here I am not that close to, which is interesting. Perhaps it reflects the different subgroups that were coming into Britain at that time. We often sort of use simplifications, which are necessary, right? You can't even talk about the subject if you want to get into every single nitty-gritty about it. But nevertheless, it's a simplification to say that there was one group of people called the Bell Beakers, and that it was many different tribes of different people that were coming in. They were not all one unified group, and the genetic examples would seem to bear that out, because otherwise I would be closely related to all of these Bronze Age people, but I'm not. I'm only related specifically closely to certain groups of them and not others. Now, here we have the Roman period, Roman gladiators. Yeah, 7.7. I'm a gladiator. I mean, I'm sure there's people sitting around here thinking like that. I think it's fun, right? I'm not saying that you shouldn't be proud of it or something, or feel like, obviously I'm doing this for a reason, but we don't want to read too much into it, right? I mean, you need to make your own life, right? You can't simply rely on the greatness of your ancestors. That being said, when I was younger, what did I want to be? I wanted to be an MMA fighter. No word of a lie. And this was when MMA was just in its infancy. And I did do amateur MMA fighting. But then I got married and my wife didn't want me to do it. So I ended up not doing it. Maybe I would be some big multi-millionaire fighter right now if that hadn't been the case. Or maybe I'd just be punch drunk. Who knows? I'm not related to any Crusader knights, I believe. No. But Merovingians I should have some relation to, yeah. Not very close. Oh, this guy is not too bad. But many people are related to this guy. He must have produced a lot of offspring, this guy. Because 20% of people... or 20... I'm 27% closer than others, right? That's not that much closer. Oh, 7.6. So, yeah, we're getting closer with that. Anyway... let's look at this timeline. Yeah, this is hard to see. Let's go to the full details. This will probably be the last thing we look at. This shows genetic distance and it shows samples, right? So 5 is relatively close, but keep in mind that that's no more closer than I think 5 was my distance to modern population groups, such as Irish or something. So I'm as close genetically to this Bell Beaker person as I am to a modern Irish person. Bell Beaker, Scotland. Let's see. But the other thing that's important in analyzing these results is also the shared DNA. For some of them, you see this shared DNA connection. That means that you actually have strands of your DNA that are exact matches with that individual sample. And that tends to indicate towards a common genetic ancestry, right? So even though you might have genetic distance that is larger, you nonetheless might actually share a common genetic ancestor if you share a large enough strand of this shared DNA. But again, I'm not any kind of genetic specialist, so don't take my word on it. That's just my interpretation. So we're just scrolling through here, looking at some examples, trying to find which is my closer ones. Here's this Bronze Age Amesbury sample that, remember, there was one sample that wasn't that close. This is the one that is close, 4.4, right, with a shared DNA of 12.29. That's fairly close. I'm fairly similar to them in terms of genetic distance, but I also share, a segment of DNA with them. Let's see if we can find any other interesting results here. Scotland, late Bronze Age. Genetic distance is larger by a little, but a shared DNA strand of 25.04. I think that's one of my largest shared strands. And that makes sense because as we were discussing, my family or my paternal line and most of my maternal line, I think, actually come from Scotland. Yeah, see, here's an example. Now, I don't know why they call it Celtic Saxon Iron Age when it's 67 BC. Why would they be saying that this person's a Saxon? This is confusing to me. I would have to look into this exact sample to see why it is that they're calling this person a Celtic Saxon. That's strange. Nevertheless, some shared similarities there. Here's the Gladiator. Yeah, the scenes that you see in like Roman British villas of the gladiators. Yeah, that was my ancestor. I think there is another sample here that oh yeah, here's a Visigothic person that they were claiming. I think that they considered might be some sort of direct ancestor of some kind. Now, based on this shared DNA, the length of this strand, right, is a lot smaller than the other sample that we saw up here. Where is it? Here's one that's 10, right? Celtic Iron Age 10, but there was another one, 25, right? This seems to indicate to me that this is a closer match than the Visigoth, but some dead air. Oh, here's the sample I was looking for. So we got the Gaelic settler Viking Iceland. Now I looked into this sample because this is another thing you can do. We're not going to do it on this, but you can go into each individual sample and find out information about that specific example and what the archaeologists note about the find, what's significant about the person and everything, right? It's very detailed. I think you have to pay money to get access to that, which I got one of the top tier ones just so I could review this properly and see what it was actually like. But shared DNA, 58.7, right? That's pretty high, or at least high compared to the other results. Even though the genetic distance perhaps is not as close. So it's this interesting relation between the two things. But this sample, what I was going to say interesting about it is that it was, even though it was 935, this person was buried in the pagan fashion. So they were buried according to pagan rites. They were not a Christian. And this also has impacts for how we understand how paganism survived in Ireland, also into the Christian period. Many people want to talk like, oh, you can't take any of the Irish writings on paganism seriously because they didn't know what they were talking about, because they had been converted to Christianity by St. Patrick in like 400 and some. Well, that's, first of all, the story of Patrick converting all of Ireland is a lie. The conversion of Ireland took place over hundreds of years, and the Druids were still a functioning organization as far as we know in the 700s AD. So the idea that people writing in the 9th century or the 10th century wouldn't have any idea about this stuff, when in fact right here we have a direct example that a Gael that had either been abducted or went to Iceland was a pagan and was buried according to pagan tradition. Obviously there was still pagans around. The Vikings were present in Ireland in fairly significant numbers as pagans as well at this time. So Clearly, the knowledge that they would have had is more significant than most people give credit. Anyway, that's for a different video. Yeah, I think that's about all the interesting stuff I wanted to say about that. But there was the last section that I wanted to cover here, and that was in relation to the genetic distance of modern populations. If I can remember where to find that. Not here, obviously. Darn it. Figures. I had it before, but here, modern populations. So here we go. Your closest genetic modern populations, Southwest English. Now this is Cornish, basically, I think what they mean by that, Southwest English. And then secondly, Southeast English, right? This is what we associate generally with the Saxon stronghold. And yet, these matches are closer than Irish, which, I actually have direct, knowledge of direct Irish ancestors of mine. And I know all the dates and times and relatives of when my relatives from Scotland immigrated to Canada. And yet, I am closer to Southwest English than I am to West Scottish or Irish. Right? That you can look at that and think that's awfully peculiar. But again, I think that the reason for this is simply because of the specific way that my genetics in my family have mixed. And that has produced an example that has me closest to people from Southeast and specifically Southwest England. And that's because the base of that population is still a plurality Celtic. So the original, Bronze Age settlers there developed a certain genetic structure, and we saw that I was closer to those examples than many others. And then, but over time, they began to diverge from the original because they're simply located and interbreeding within their own regions. But you bring in the admixture of the Saxons and the Norse into that, and you reintroduce elements that were originally present, and so it brings you back into the realm of where they were originally, right? At least this is my bonkers theory about it, right? I mean, it just seems to be like that would be why I'm closer to someone from Southwest England, because there is that base of the Celtic DNA. I say Celtic in quotes there because it's really Bronze Age. It's really something that's proto-Celtic. And Celtic, I'm using Celtic as a specific cultural group rather than a genetic group, right? And so you have this Bronze Age population group, and then it mixes in with this later Germanic population group, and so that seems to be why I am closer to someone from like Cornwall or something than I am to someone from Ireland or even Scotland, where I actually have my direct ancestry is from. Here you see it mapped out. So here you have the Cornish example, West England. Here you have East England. Here's Ireland, Wales, Scottish, right? Orcadians further out. Danish somewhat over there somewhere. But you have, the other groups are pretty far away, right? And so it's fairly clear that this is the grouping that I'm in, right? It's a mix of these different groups that's produced this. So if you take that and these together, you map somewhere around here. So that's why it's closer to this, because this Southwest English DNA simply has more of the same mixture that I do. Anyway, that's the breakdown of my genetic analysis according to mytrueancestry.com. I wish I was getting paid to review this page. I'm not. So if you'd like to support me on Patreon, because this thing actually costed quite a bit of money. I got this Zeus. It's pretty lame titles, I guess, for this, but it's called the level of Zeus, where you get access to like most of the information, and it costs a pretty penny. I think it's like $200. Not cheap, and I don't have that much free cash. But I wanted to do a sort of in-depth look at this site so that people can get an idea about it, and it is very interesting stuff. How accurate is it? Well, it's accurate as you can be in ways when you're talking about this, because they're taking actual samples, right? Archaeogenetic samples, and matching them to your own. I don't know if I really have any Visigothic ancestry, right? I think I got into that at the beginning of this. I think that it's more likely that it's simply a reflection of my particular mixture of different groups has resulted in something that's very similar to this. So that if you take a Visigoth and you take a Celtic DNA strand and you mix them together, that's what's more likely to produce a result like mine than simply a Celt or simply a Saxon or simply a Visigoth, right? Visigoth alone is genetic distance of 7.7, right? A Celt alone is a distance of 6.2. A Saxon, who perhaps is actually an example of some kind of minimal combination of these various Germanic and Celtic groups and Norse groups, is a little bit closer. But when you start combining those groups together, then you're getting in the realm of a very close match. Anyway, I hope you found this interesting. I think it's a great site. I don't know if I'd pay for Zeus level stuff unless you're really into it, but you can certainly spend a lot of time looking into all of these things, and there's a lot more that we didn't even get into in this video. So, Gurav Mila Magat Aseshak Agus Marigoni Shas Gohard.